Okay.
All right, welcome everybody to the Kentuckiana Developers Group. And today we have Sully, David Sullivan of Mandelbrot LLC, going to be talking to us a little bit about some messaging connectivity, text messaging, and stuff like that. So I'm going to turn it right over to Sully.
Thanks, Ron. If you could go ahead and enable screen sharing, I have a couple of slides to share with you. Ron and I met at Pause on Air. I definitely recommend going to Pause on Air if you haven't gone. It's a great time and you meet a lot of people there. It's a lot of fun. So I had a, yeah, sorry.
Screen sharing, did I get it? Is it enabled?
Let's see. Yep. Okay, you got it.
Okay, right.
So a couple of slides to share with you. So we're going to be talking about text messaging and FileMaker today. So I've given parts of this presentation in about 5 different other circumstances. So when Ron approached me to put this together, I kind of Frankenstein together those other 5 decks of slides, and I ran through it just one time last night. So I'm going to be depending on you guys to stop me and ask questions and make sure that I don't just glaze over stuff that is important to you. So I've done so many of these integrations with text messaging. Back in 2020, I published a solution to the FileMaker, or sorry, the Claris Marketplace, my first messaging solution there. And since then, I think there's about 30, 25 to 35 in production solutions that are using this. So there is a very large variety of reasons that people use text messaging in FileMaker. And just to kind of open up the scope and help you think about, well, which ones of my customers might need something like this? The advantages of text messaging is that you get a short burst of information to a very wide audience in a low amount of time. Text messages get opened a lot more than emails do. So advertisers know this, and that's one of the reasons that they're able to get so much information to people in such a short time, right? They can hit you when you're not really looking. Also, you can capture a small amount of data from non-users, right? So you don't have to have people log in or fill out a form or go to a website. If you just need a simple response like up or down or 1 or 5, yes, no, left, right. So those types of interactions can be scripted out pretty easily. And it also doesn't require you to have users create login information or remember passwords. There's no licensing barriers, right? So you don't have to put people into WebDirect or FMP. So think about the different communication channels that you currently use, whether you're using forums or actually creating users, whether you're using voice calls or emails. How does text messaging fit into those things? And when can you actually just skip over the whole process with composing an email or trying to deal with a voice call, or scheduling a voice call, and just use a text message? Okay. So here's some technologies that I support or use. So the most important one is probably Twilio. So Twilio is the service that distributes the text messages that I want to send from FileMaker and receives them in a way that I can return those messages into FileMaker. It's a third-party service. There's many other messaging services like this out there. Amazon has one called the SNS. There's another big one called Bandwidth. The reason I like Twilio is because it's a large company that has a lot of different things that are outside of text messaging, and they're very developer focused. So they have the advantage of having more developers and having better documentation than a lot of the other places that I've investigated. As far as technologies related to FileMaker to access Twilio, so Twilio is the messaging provider that Claris Connect uses. And if you're not using Claris Connect, then you're going to be using insert from URL and webhooks, right, to send and receive your messages. So what's Twilio? right? So this is a set of APIs that allow you to do with phones what FileMaker does with apps, right? So if you can do it with a phone, you can probably do it with Twilio. There's, I think, at least 500 different individual API calls, right? Little sets of instructions you can send to these guys that'll make it do something to a phone. Now, we're only going to be focusing on a small subset of those with Twilio's programmable messaging API. But no matter what you do with Twilio, there's a couple of things that you'll have to do first. So one of them is setting up your account. If you haven't set up an account with Twilio yet, if you use this referral link, right, this will send me $10, which is kind of nice, right? And if somebody's going to make the $10, I'd appreciate it if it was me, right? So you basically go to that website, you put in a credit card, and then you start off by purchasing a local or toll-free number. They have them all over the world, but if you're using a domestic toll-free or a domestic toll-free or local number, it's $1 or $2 per month. So aside from that, you're only going to pay for usage, which is really nice when you compare that to the way a traditional cell phone works. So you think about, I don't know how much your cell phones cost, but usually it's somewhere between $30 and $100 a month that people pay for cell phone service. So instead think about, well, this is $1 or $2 per phone number. And after that, I'm just paying a couple of pennies per text message. So after you purchase those numbers, you configure them. It's not very difficult to do that. It's a couple of web forms that you fill out and tell it, okay, where do I want my messages to go? And where do I want phone calls to go? And if that fails, then, what are you going to do with those messages and calls? So beyond that, there's some other settings that are a little bit more advanced. One thing I will recommend is that you, if you are planning on sending more than 300 to 500 messages per day, that you're going to want to register a campaign in the Trust Hub. So there's some new rules that they've put together in the last 2 years about spam messaging. So we'll get into those in a couple of slides, but I just wanted to mention that sometimes that's part of the setup that you're going to want to perform for your clients. Okay. Anybody have any questions so far? Get a sip of water here.
Can you post that link in the chat for us?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yep. I will post that. Let's do that at the end. So don't let me forget. Post link to chat. Make a note. Okay. So as developers, we need a way to make FileMaker talk to Twilio so that Twilio can move the text messages around for us. So it's important to understand these things because at some point your integration is going to break. There's just no two ways about it, especially with something with moving parts. Someday you're going to get a call from a customer that says, my text message didn't go through, what the hell happened? So you're going to need to understand some of the basic building blocks of how this stuff works. So the way that Claris Connect communicates with Twilio, you have triggers that you can use. These are things where if something happens in Twilio, then it triggers a workflow in Claris Connect. So the two triggers they have available are a completed voice call or a new SMS being received. So something then happens, you say, okay, give me a script that will run in my FileMaker solution or set off a different type of a workflow that does something else. Then there's also actions. These are things that you can do yourself. You don't have to wait for Twilio to do anything. And it can send text messages, it can send multimedia messages as long as you've stored the media at a public URL, or you can send a fax as long as the PDF is at a public URL, or you can place an outbound call, but that does require a webhook. So what do you see here as far as the things that you can do? There are some limitations, right? So I, like I mentioned about this to Ron earlier, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a a big red easy button. This is 90% of the use cases that people have for text messaging. But if there's other things that you need to do, right, you want to be able to place calls, but you don't understand how to build a webhook, or there's a lot of picture messaging that you need to do, but you're not sure how to store your media publicly, right? Then you're going to have to get into some of the more advanced things that Claris Connect does not have the functionality for. So for those things, you're going to be looking at insert from URL and webhooks, right? So one thing that's going to help dramatically with insert from URL, there's this thing called the API Explorer in Twilio's dashboard. It has, let me see if I can actually bring it up, because this is kind of fun. Let me grab a new window here. So if I go to Twilio, see if I can log in real quick. When you're doing curl options for these things, especially when you're creating these requests, it can get very, very tricky to remember how to do them. Oop, two-factor authentication. No, okay, I must have signed in the last 30 days. So it's extremely helpful to have all of the documentation set up this way. Like this is for voice. If I want to place an outbound phone call, it lists all the parameters I need for my insert from URL, and it also stacks them up as curl, right? So if I throw in, a phone number here, you can see over here, it's actually generating that curl as we go, right? So that's pretty cool. I can also, once my request is ready to go, I can click make request and it'll send the response here. So how many of you folks out there use Postman when you're doing these requests? Right? Is anybody still there? Okay, so it's basically the same thing as Postman, but it's got all their documentation put in there at the same time, which is really nice. Now, most of these things are there's all of these different things that you can do, right? These are just some of them. There's all these different things that are available in Twilio through using insert from URL, but the one that I'm going to highlight is retrieving the delivery status of a text message. That's become more important. You remember how I was talking about you're going to want to use the Trust Hub in Twilio to fill out, here's the, well, in order to try to reduce the amount of filtering you get from spam, right? Well, in 2020, there was an initiative that was kind of put together by cell phone carriers that said, we're getting too many text messages. The text messages are all from applications. Why are all of this stuff is spam? Well, what's going to happen if people all start using WhatsApp or Signal or an alternative messaging application for this type of thing? They're going to eventually stop using text messages, and we'll stop having people use our cell carriers, right? So we're going to lose customers. So they banded together and put some guide rails in place to help eliminate spam text messages. You might also have noticed that they did something similar with voice calls. I'm sure you've gotten at least one call where it says spam likely or spam risk or something like that, instead of showing even the phone number right on your cell phone. It just basically says, don't answer this call. Well, when you do a voice call that's a spam risk, it says spam risk. When you have a text message that they think is a spam risk, the cell company doesn't even deliver it, right? So the text message goes from an application to AT&T, and AT&T looks at it and says, this doesn't pass my smell test, and it just throws the message out. So there's some ways to get less of your messages filtered, right? So especially if you're sending a lot of them at a time, like if you're setting up a loop that's going to send out one text message that's the same to everybody on a list of 1,000 records, right? So the first one is allow at least a second between the text messages, right? So the rate at which you send the messages is going to be one of the bigger factors in avoiding filtering. If you can set it up so your server just runs in the background and sends a message every other second, then there's a much lower chance of filtering. Also, if you fill out your form in the Trust Hub, right? So I'll show you where that is too. Like if I jump over to account and you go over here to A2P messaging, application to person messaging, and you go in here, there's forms that you fill out here. You register a business, you register a brand, you register campaign uses, and then the campaign registry, which is these cell carriers all banded together, they assign you a trust score. And based upon that trust score, Twilio is going to limit the number of outbound messages that you can send in a certain amount of, well, actually, I'm not sure that Twilio does that, but the cell carriers definitely will. So the number of messages they'll deliver for you in a set amount of time will adjust compared to what your score is. So now, no matter what you do to increase deliverability, there's one last piece that you have to consider with this. It's that Twilio is not going to hold up your FileMaker solution while it waits to see whether or not your message was filtered. So in other words, the best you're going to get back as a result from Twilio is status equals queued rather than status equals delivered. So you might send it 1,000 messages and it queues all of them up, but you don't know whether they're actually being delivered until you check to see if they're delivered later on. So if you're concerned at all about your messages not being delivered, one of the most important things you can do is check the delivery status of the messages that you're sending. Don't just wait for them to show up as errors in the Twilio console. You won't be able to track them as well there. Put together your own reports, put together statistics, especially if you're doing large campaigns where you're pushing messages, a lot of them in a short amount of time. Does anybody have any questions about message filtering and the campaign registry, the Trust Hub? Those things are a little bit goofy.
Sully?
Yeah.
So it mentioned $50 per campaign. Is that right?
You know, the way that these are set up, when you register a US brand, you're registering, it's $45 or $44, right? And then there's a $50 one-time registration fee for each campaign. So you have to think about this as, am I going to be sending out more than, say, 500 messages in a day? If the answer is yes, then you're probably going to want to have your client sign up for one of these to make sure all the messages get delivered. If you're not going to be sending out that many messages, like if it's just something where you're confirming today's appointments for 30 to 50 text messages out in a day, then you don't have to necessarily do this, right? You can just check and say, well, did that message get delivered? And if not, I'll just try to send it again, right? So this is really meant for people who are bulk senders, in other words, Jonathan. So but I mean, that's one of the first things that my customers ask me about whenever it's like, hey, we want to do text messaging. What else can we do with the text messaging that you've set up? I mean, we have the code for it now. What if we sent a text message to everyone? Like, okay, well, we can do that, but the best thing to do if you're going to send 100,000 messages is to register your brand, create a business profile. They basically do everything that you would get when you're like applying for for some sort of a loan or a credit card. They're going to look at your business the same way that they would look at a person and say, show me your website, give me a Dun and Bradstreet number, let me see what kind of messages you're planning on sending. What's the address? Can we call and actually talk to somebody that works for you? Because they're desperately trying to fight against spam messages that are just thousands and thousands of people trying to sell you fake car warranties, right? So yeah, so I mean, somebody's got to pay for this stuff. And if you have a high volume campaign, these fees are not very expensive.
Sure.
They do have a starter campaign where you it's kind of an in between where they have a limit on the number of messages, and it's a less expensive way of doing things. But I don't know, is there a particular use case you have in mind for this sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a company that does events, and so during the event, like would be a Saturday evening, they would have a flurry of text messages. Every person there would get like 5 to 8 messages that evening, and then there won't be anything for weeks until the next event. So do you think that would require some kind of registration, or do
Right.
you think a flurry of several hundred in one evening is going to be enough to trigger their flag?
Well, if it's in a short amount of time, then you're probably going to want to create a trust hub entry for it and register the campaign. The number of messages per second is what you're going to be most concerned about. I think that's in here somewhere. Like my campaign, yeah, see, like I have a trust score of 37 because I'm just one guy, right? I can send 10,000 T-Mobile messages a day. Other carriers are not specified, right? But then if you look at, there's another spot in here. Was it this one? It's been a while since I've been in this part. Where's my message limits? Check your rate limit here. There we go. So scores are between 1 and 100. Usually the people who are in this top tier are people that have 30 or 50 employees at least, and or they are listed on the Russell 2000 index. I think there's another way that you can just basically get 100 score without really doing anything. But the people who are 49 and below, you can send 4 messages per second at the most. Now that's for declared use with a campaign. So if you have 100 people at your event, then it's going to take 25 seconds at the least to send them all messages. Now, for mixed use, this is a pretty much an undeclared use case. It drops down to like 1.25, right? So if you don't declare, this is the type of message I'm sending, and it's okay. These people are ones that we that are expecting this particular message, right? Especially if your message includes things like URLs or phone numbers, right? Because you have to think, what's the cell carrier going to try to filter out? Well, the ones where it says click here, and then that link takes you to somewhere that installs something nasty on your phone, right? Or puts a cookie on your phone, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, right. So registering that, like that's going to immediately increase you up to 4, right? Unless you're at a totally unregistered, no campaign type of a thing. So there's also some starter use cases, right? So, and those numbers are a little bit lower. So this can all get kind of confusing, right? So again, it's the best thing to do is again to check the delivery, right? You have one script that's sending out all the messages, and you have another script that goes through and says, did everything get delivered? And if it wasn't delivered, can I send it again? Right. So that's
Okay.
just a different one. Yeah.
At 25, taking a minute to send them all is not a problem.
Yeah.
So if that's all that's required is to just space them out, then
I was just thinking the same thing, Jonathan. Basically, do a little math to make sure that the number of seconds between messages is going to make sure that you're under the threshold, right?
Mhm.
And then you fire them away, and okay, so it takes 3 minutes to send them all out.
Right.
Not, I mean,
That is
unless you're somebody who's sending out thousands, and I wouldn't be. So
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it just depends on how big your event is and the number of people that have been put onto your phone list. Right.
Yeah,
right.
it's in the hundreds. It's not in the thousands. So
So I have one customer who's basically it's not American Idol, but they're putting a phone number on screen, basically,
oh wow.
and asking people to vote. So it's kind of the same thing as the event that you're talking about, but you put in 100,000 people, and you can't send them all back a hey, we received your vote and thanks for voting. You can't do that. Like you have to meter them out, otherwise you'll just never get the throughput that you need in order to send them back a thanks for voting. And then what happens if people send a text message and nothing comes back? Then they're like, well, I wonder if I can just vote 20 times. So, right, they send 15 or 20 messages instead of sending 1 or 2 because you didn't send them back a message that says, thank you for voting, your vote only counts once, right? So it's weird when you get up to that level of that amount of input. You have to do things a little differently in FileMaker as well. So
Well,
you can't.
we know why they do that. So, you know, we have to accommodate. You know,
Right.
we can adjust. Yeah.
Right. So,
Thanks.
yeah, of course. Anybody have another question about filtering or campaigns? Cool. On we go. So now one more thing. I wanted to hit this basic explanation of HTTP requests and insert from URL. This is one of the barriers to entry that people have about using APIs, about consuming APIs. And if all you're trying to do is send out text messages and read them later, then this is all you really need. So, so bear with me. There's only 4 slides about this, right? So here's an HTTP request. This is how the entire internet is built. Right? You type google.com into your browser, and it packages up this request, this piece of information that's going to be sent from one computer to another, and then there's a response that comes back. So this is an HTTP GET for google.com. So you say to google.com, or you say to Google server, give me google.com, it sends back the HTML, and the browser renders that HTML into what you see on your screen, right? So FileMaker does the same thing. Like say you wanted to peel out the image, the URL of the Google image, right? Because sometimes the word Google has got some really cool art on it, right? So insert from URL does the same thing. It asks the same question of Google server, but instead of rendering it in a browser, it returns the response as a variable, or it assigns it to a field. So you can then say, I'm going to save the HTML, and then I'm going to parse it out and find that URL inside the HTML, so I can store that. Or you could even go one step further, send a second GET, and then return the data to a container and just store the image itself. So when you switch out Google with an API, you're basically doing the same thing, only you can now use different verbs. So it's not just give me the information. You can also post information, patch information. You can delete, you can put. There's a bunch of different verbs that are available to you. And the amount of information you can send along, you can send data, and you can send authentication credentials, right? A username and a password, or an API key. Those allow you to do a lot more interesting things, right? So Twilio is going to do something different when you send it different messages, and then it's going to always return a response, right? So in our use case, what we're doing is we're sending a post to Twilio's server, and it's going to send a response that says, we've queued up to send your text message, right? So Twilio takes care of all of this part on the rest, or all of this other stuff. You don't have to understand anything about the publicly switched telephone network. So Twilio does all of that for you. So when you're constructing these HTTP requests to communicate with outside services, there's really 3 different options. You have a target, right? That's where you're going to store the information that is returned. So that's a variable or it's a field. Then you have a URL, which is where you're sending the information. And then of course the curl, which is everything else. So your authentication, your what type of response you're expecting, basically whether it'll be JSON or XML or HTML, you tell it, I accept JSON, right? Okay. The data for your request, right? The data is going to be things like, where is the, what phone number am I sending to? What phone number am I sending from? What is the body of my text message? What is the URL of the picture I'm sending along with it, right? Do you guys want to see some of the code for this, or can you, do you want to just have me give you a link to a demo file later? Both.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. Let me grab my script workspace here real quick. Okay, cool. So hopefully that opened. This is the same, this is the Mandelbrot MMS scripts, right? Send from the conversations layout. So this is sending a text message. It's got a little bit more information that you probably need, but here you see, this is the URL, right? We're setting the URL as a variable, and we're setting from, to, and body, right? So I'm getting those from a parameter, and then I'm going to set the curl options. Now, if there is container data that I'm trying to send as media, then my curl options, sorry, I have too many monitors. My curl options are going to look like this. Here's a header that says I'm doing a post. There's my authorization. Now with Twilio, you have a username that's your account SID, basically your account number, and then an auth token, which is basically your password, right? So it's not the same username and password you use to log into their dashboard, but it is what the API needs in order to send your messages. So when you're sending the body, it's this little small d and then body, and get is URL encoded body. Why get is URL encoded? Well, we're sending this basically through something like an address bar on a browser. So it's got to be URL encoded. Otherwise, if you put in an ampersand, like that weird squiggly and thing, or if you put in a quotation mark or an apostrophe, it's going to read that differently than it should, and your text message is going to get garbled, right? One of the most common questions I get from people is, why isn't it sending the whole body of my message? And 99% of the time it's, are you sending a reserved character? Did you remember to use get from get as URL encoded, right? So then you're also going to send a couple other values to and from. And then if you have a container that has some, or well, if you have a URL for an image or a video or something else that you want to send along, right? Media URL. So I can get into some of the ways to get that data out, right? So we have a URL, we have curl options, and then the next thing that we do is here, right? So I'm setting, oh, hit cancel there. So my target is a result. My URL is URL. Everything keeps opening off screen, and then my curl is just curl, right? I like to set these as what's it called? I like to set them as variables first, just because it makes it easier to read this line. So cool. Also, I usually will do a verify SSL certificates. You don't have to leave this checked, but you know, it's Twilio is a known quantity, so I know that I'm not going to have to worry about the SSL certificate on the other side not being there. They're going to keep up with that. If it was some API where it's like, I'm not really sure where these guys are going to actually have it together, right? Maybe they wouldn't have an SSL certificate once in a while, and I might not verify it. But I want to make sure that my data is actually getting to Twilio, and it's a very well-known company. So there's hackers that are probably trying to intercept text messages, which actually brings up one other item. Text messaging is not secure. Do not use this to send pictures of financial information, patient information, personally identifying information, right? If you use iMessage to text between two iPhones, that's encrypted. If you use, what is it? Is it Google Chat that they use on Android phones? I don't know. If you use Signal or WhatsApp, that stuff's encrypted. If you use just the normal everyday text messaging network, that's not encrypted. Somebody who's sitting at AT&T, who is somehow plugged into their data stream, can read every text message that goes through. So unless you have your own encryption protocol set up on both ends, you don't want to use this for high security applications or for things that could identify people, right? So it's useful when you're setting up a way to like what's it called, to reset like a password. It's not useful for sending somebody their password, but especially if it's for banking or for healthcare or something like that. Cool. Okay. Any questions about this send code? Okay, on we go. So if you're still with us, you're probably wondering about replies. How do I read replies? And if you were here a couple of years ago, the last time I presented at this group, you probably remember the next 2 slides. There's 2 ways that you can deal with replies. You can pull them down in batches, which is insert from URL on a scheduled script that runs every X number of minutes, right? The other way is to push them in through the data API. So there's different circumstances where each one is the better choice. If all you expect is a very minimal response, pull is okay, right? If you're only expecting, like you're sending out a message that you're not expecting anybody to respond to, there's no need to set up all the extra work to do a pull rather than to do a push rather than a pull. A script that runs on a loop every 5 minutes or so is going to be just fine if you're not expecting anybody to really text you back. If, however, you expect conversations or you want to create a chatbot or run scripts based upon your messages, push is much more important. Like you want to be able to get that right away. Now think about what would happen if you got a text message from an application and you send it back a response, and then you put your phone back in your pocket, and 5 minutes later, it sends back the next question. So you take your phone out of your pocket, you send it another message, you put it back in your pocket. 5 minutes later, you get another beep, and it asks you a third question, right? You can't really do a chatbot that's slow like that. It needs to be faster. Otherwise, people will eventually just say, I'm just going to call them, or I'm just going to do something else, and you'll lose the advantage of using text message as a channel, right? So generally, people who put their phones away, you have until they've answered their last text message that's open before they're going to put their phone away. So if they have 5 or 6 different messages, I mean, you guys have seen the way that the iPhone's last update in iOS has focus, right? It has one for sleeping and one for do not disturb and one for working, and right. So the people who make these phones understand this is a problem with people's focus. So you basically have until they turn back to whatever they're doing. And once they do, they're back on do not disturb. You're not going to get messages back through to them. So you have to really be aware of how fast these conversations are going to happen. Now with push is a little different. It's Claris Connect or a webhook is pushing the message. It comes from Twilio, then it goes through. This could be replaced here with Claris Connect, and I believe Claris Connect is basically doing the same thing, right? So you have a webhook that's in here or Claris Connect that's taking that data and pushing it in through the data API. So in real time, a message comes from Twilio that it goes through some sort of refactorization here and then gets pushed into your solution immediately. So that can give you a lot faster of a response time. There are some limitations to that. Of course, the biggest one is that building a webhook is not a trivial thing, right? That's one of the reasons that Claris Connect exists, is because it's not trivial to understand how do I write enough JavaScript or Python or whatever to navigate, this the FileMaker data API. I don't use Claris Connect a lot, but it's mostly because I've already written the code for this 100 times, and all I end up doing is copy and pasting my web. Really need it, but once you have that record inside of FileMaker, you also still have to do all this other stuff, right? So like this is an example of what I mean by that. This is Mandelbrot MMS. Well, it's cool that it has all this threaded conversation stuff, but if I send it a text message, I'm going to send hopefully the demo gods are with me today. Send it a message, hello, and we'll send it a picture along with the message in the next one. If I send this a message, is it going to pop up on the screen without me touching anything? Like, this is a portal, right? Portals don't like to refresh themselves always when you don't touch anything, right? So if you're monitoring this conversation, waiting for somebody to text back, how does FileMaker understand to put that information on the screen fresh? What kind of ninja jujitsu do you have to do in order to make this actually work? So a little new message button there too. Let's see what happens if I send it a message with a photo. What photo do we want to send? Yeah, this one's pretty cool. Boats. We'll send it the boats. Hopefully my my internet's working well today. Okay, good. So off that sends. It takes a minute to wind its way through the network, and then it's going to refresh this message, right? So if I hit there, this is I'm going to export that. I just recently moved to the Marina City Towers in Chicago. It's those two buildings that look like corn cobs. And every Wednesday and Saturday, the sailboats go down the Chicago River and out to Lake Michigan. That's pretty cool. They have to raise the bridges. It sounds like there's a church with all of its bells, right? Because that's the sounds they use for the bridges going up. But I think there's 18 bridges on the Chicago River. They open them up one at a time, and then a dozen or so sailboats go through, right? So getting these images and things in real time, though, if you have I use this a lot for customers, right? Like a lot of these folks are customers. And if I'm trying to debug something for them, one of the fastest ways that I can get information from them is just say, take a screenshot of it on your phone and send it to me in a text message. Then I can, take this out. I can say, okay, cool. Well, let me draw here. So it's this boat. That's the one that you need, right? And then I can save this as an image, right? And then send it back pretty quickly. So I'll just add this back over here, throw this in, insert a picture. And okay, it's probably the wrong, I don't know where I put this. Oh, no. Save it in documents. Probably. So this, by the way, that's we'll send that one. Right. So that'll send off. I wonder if you'll be able to hear my phone beep. Oh, no, but it's very quiet, but yes, my phone did beep. So anyhow, I digress. So the point is, if you're gonna get conversational with these messages, you really do want to use push in order to get the messages back. Now, to do that, I use AWS Lambda and the Amazon API gateway, but Twilio is also connected to Claire's Connect. That's the kind of the big red easy button for doing it. But if you want a permanent webhook and you only want to pay for it once, then my my templates do come with those attached. So not to try to undercut Claris, but I've been selling them that way since before Claris Connect existed. SMS, the inbound webhook and the template, I sell for about $300, and the MMS when I sell for $450, and that's as many text messages as you want to send, right? And it's one time rather than paying for it every year. So there's a few more odds and ends here that I didn't have time to put slides together for. One of them is that in order for all this to work, especially for pushing messages in, your data API has to be healthy and available. So that means that you're going to want to use Zabbix or some sort of monitoring in order to make sure you're actually getting your text messages when they're being delivered. So one of the easiest ways to do that is to send yourself, like have FileMaker send itself a text message every day or every hour or however often you need to, have it send some sort of a code and then put it in the receiving of the the script for receiving. And if it returns that code, then okay, you're good. You know that your messages are working and that you're able to receive text messages. If it doesn't receive that code, right, if you can send but you can't receive, then you know that your webhook's down or there's something wrong with Claire's Connect or something else, right? So I've had a lot of customers call me over the last 2 years and say, hey, why am I not getting any text messages? I don't get it. And usually about half the time, they'll also say there has to be something wrong with your code. It's like, well, what changes did you make? What's going on, right? And my first inclination is, are you sure it's my code and not yours, right? So I'll go into a couple of dashboards, I'll look for the problem. Most of the time I find out it's a change that they made, but once in a while I'll find out it's the server, right? Like I have a customer in Montana that his reason for using text messages, he'll get a call about a wildfire and they'll say, well, we need 25 paramedics and 50 fire line rated firefighters. Okay, well, he'll send out a text message to 1,000 people, and the first 50 or 75 people who respond will get deployed to that fire. Well, if he tells me on Tuesday that his text messages aren't coming in and it's been going on since Friday, then that can make a really big difference for whether or not that technology is relied upon, right? So you have to set up monitoring. You have to have a way to tell, is this actually working or not? One of the other ways to do this is to use push and pull at the same time. You use push for real-time text messaging where the messages come in, but as a fallback, you also set up pull, right? So every 5 minutes or every hour or every once in a while, it goes into Twilio and you pick out, okay, do we have all the messages? Do we actually get everything? And whenever it has messages that weren't delivered or that you didn't get, it's going to send your cell phone a text message and say, okay, I tried to pull out all the messages. I found that 1 out of 1,000 of them didn't actually get to us. It's like, okay, one might be a blip. If it's 1,000 out of 1,000, then you know, hey, maybe my data API is turned off, or maybe the webhook broke, or maybe I made a change in my code that made it so none of the messages are coming in anymore. So you want to keep monitoring. Otherwise, you're going to run into problems like that. You also can consider setting up an SQS queue. Amazon's simple queue service, where if your webhook is getting high volume, like you're getting 10,000 votes a second, then you're going to want to consider the strain that will put on your server. So you can do one server connection per text message on the data API. That's how I prefer to do things. Some people will reuse the API keys, right? Or the access tokens, I should say, that are generated by the data API, but that can run into issues where you have session collisions. I like to do things one at a time, where it only receives one text message at a time, because it also avoids problems with record locking, right? If 2 different users try to interact with the same record at the same time, what happens? FileMaker picks one of the users, usually the one that was first, and lets them interact with that record. Well, if it's 50 different votes from the same phone number that are all trying to go to the same record at the same time and do different things to it, it's going to cause havoc on your system. So SQS is a way that you can just say, no matter how much you have to give me, only give me one at a time. And I'll process those one at a time and make sure that I don't run into any of those issues with record locking and session collisions. It also keeps you from hitting that 500 max connections on the data API. So one other piece of advice, don't build replies directly into your main file. Like if you're building replies, build them in a separate file for inbound messages. You want that to be separate because all of the overhead that's in your main file, think about security and startup scripts and communications issues and file permissions and all of that stuff that goes along with, well, how long does it really take to open this main file? for most people opening a FileMaker solution in FileMaker Pro, it's going to be anywhere from 5 seconds to 5 minutes for it to actually load the first layout. And think about what Twilio wants to do. They want to give you your message and then return a response, right? And if they can't return a response within the first 3 to 5 seconds, a lot of times it'll say error, this message did not get delivered, and it'll start trying to deliver it again, right? So it also, when you have those issues with connecting to your main file, can run into a couple other different odds and ends as far as issues go, just on the webhook side. But the way to avoid that situation is, if you're going to connect the two files together, don't connect the text file to the main file as the main file being the external data source. Do it the other way around. The text file is the external data source for your main file. In other words, put the relationship graph together for your main file as having the text file on that relationship graph. Don't go into the text file and set the main file as the one that's on the text file's relationship graph. So that way, when you open the text file, it's not trying to open the main file at the same time, right? Only when you open the main file would it open the text messages. And then the last piece of advice before I jump into links: if you want to send images with your text messages, you're going to need Twilio to have a public URL for the image. So that means you're either using a file sharing site like AWS S3, or you're getting the URL of your container data through the data API. So you may need some help with those things. The easiest way to upload container data is this right here, awsS3.fm. So I'll put these links in the chat here in a second. I wonder if I can just, I can't. Hold on, let me see if I'll do it this way. Hide my notes. I'm just going to throw this in the chat, right? So I built an API that helps you get container data out of your FileMaker solution and post it into S3. Then you can make it public, make it private, move it, rename it, delete it. All the things that you typically would want to do with data in S3. Now, I did this because I looked at the script that has been floating around the community to do that. I think it was written in 2018 by a pretty well-known developer that I will not name, and it's 200 lines of script, and I don't like putting stuff into my solutions that I don't understand. And I was really concerned that at some point that would break or it would cause performance issues. So I thought to myself, I can already do this from the other side. So I made an API where instead of a 200-line script, you make a parameter in one line. And in the second line, you use insert from URL to tell my API, where's my file, where's the container file, how do I get to it, where am I going to put it in AWS S3, and what visibility does it need to have. And then S3 on the other side goes and plucks the file out of your FileMaker solution, right? So instead of having a beach ball spin while a variable fills up with the whole, with the entire file, it says, okay, I got that. And it does it in the background. It's really cool. So if you don't want to do that, right, like those are useful if you have a message that you're sending to 1,000 people. If you're just sending one specific thing to one specific person, a lot of times it's easier to use a URL from your container data. So at this website, you have a white paper that I did when I was putting together MMS about how to self-reference the data API. Basically, what you're doing is you're doing an insert from URL from FileMaker to the same server that you're on. It's a lot like using execute data API, the script step, or the function. I can't remember which one is. It actually gives you a lot of this information, but it doesn't give you a URL for your container data. In order to get that, you actually have to approach it as if you were just an everyday outside application, and you're trying to pick up what is the URL for this. So the basic gist is you save the credentials that you would need to log in, you create a user, and you reference that, you query yourself, and you query the data API from inside your FileMaker solution. As long as nobody else uses that URL before whatever you're handing that, as long as nobody else uses the URL for the container before Twilio does, it'll allow you to use that as your media URL, which is really kind of cool. So then there's also this demo file, right? If you'd like to hit a demo file that has all of the code that I showed for the outbound SMS, it's there. And then there's SMS and MMS that are here. The demo file is outbound only, but the SMS and MMS templates include a webhook for inbound. And I sell the SMS one for, I think, $245. The MMS is $445. And you can use as many text messages as you want. You don't have to worry about hitting any limits. It is a permanent webhook. So, and then there's my referral link for Twilio. Okay, so so that's it. Questions, comments, concerns?
So this in its simplest format with text messaging, say you just wanted to send a text notification and not worry about get the response. That's essentially just insert from URL out of FileMaker. And if you you can use just FileMaker to get the response if you're like querying and getting the responses is like pulling them down in batches, so to speak, or running a script. But where it really gets complicated, it's when you're trying to get like the live response, so to speak, the instant real-time response. And so it's either, so you can't do that with just FileMaker, right? You have to have either Connect or you have to have webhooks that are written for it. Okay.
Yes. So if you're sending out just a notification and you're not really worried about the response, or you can read the responses in an hour and it's not going to make a difference, then insert from URL is enough. And for some simple things where the response might just be one message, where you're saying, hey, I just need a yes or a no on this. And it doesn't matter if you get yes or no 5 minutes from now or 5 hours from now, then insert from URL might be enough, right? But as soon as you start getting conversational, or you start doing things like, I need a script to run and it needs to run at a certain time it has to happen in a certain order, then you're going to start getting into the part where you need webhooks and Claris Connect, especially with things like chatbots, or if you have a customer service center that's trying to set appointments, right? So the worst thing that you can have happen is for the messages not to get delivered and not not have the right timeline for those things. Right. So especially if you're sending out messages, if you're doing a conversational thing and you have to sit there and click refresh, right? You don't want to have refresh buttons for these things. iMessage has kind of spoiled everybody. The quality of the messaging applications we have on our cell phones is so good that it's spoiled everybody in a big way. And FileMaker is never going to be able to replicate the functionality that the team at Apple does for iMessage, right? So no matter what we do, we're always going to be a little bit behind those guys. So, but for a lot of the stuff that we have, I mean, you might need a record of the conversation. And how many times have you had a text message conversation that you wish was attached to your FileMaker records, right? So it is useful to have those things.
I had another question, but this is kind of a little off topic. It just touches on the URL to a container. Are there requirements for that as far as how your image is stored? Does it have to be encrypted storage? Can you do open storage? Does it have to be external or?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, the FileMaker data API doesn't care how you've chosen to store that container. It does make a difference as far as performance goes, but it doesn't make a difference as far as consuming the URL and getting the image out of out of the FileMaker server. So the server will take care of that part for you. If you have a few thousand images to upload to S3 and you're doing it that way, then it can make a difference in how fast they're going. Mostly because the CPU, if you're using encrypted storage, is going to have to decode all of that stuff, right? So also, whether you're storing it inside the file or outside of the file. Inside of the file is a little bit slower, I believe, than outside of the file.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. The reason I ask is because earlier I mentioned I've been doing a lot of work with data API, and I've been running into a problem with trying to display an image from a container field, and I'm still trying to figure out why I'm having that difficulty, but that's another topic. So,
yeah. So the white paper that I wrote about that, I think, is from I want to say it's from 2020, maybe even before that. But it's one of those moments where I was like, oh wow, like it's a eureka moment. It's like, I could just do this by self-referencing and pulling this out on its own.
Yeah.
This actually works. I couldn't believe that it worked. I thought that there was going to be some sort of extra thing that I needed to do, and it worked pretty simply. So that might help you if you take a look at that.
yeah, I've got the link pulled up so I can take a look at it afterwards. And just for a little bit more understanding of that, when it provides a URL to your container, are you saying that that's a temporary URL, that
right?
It's not like a static permanent URL to that container?
Right. The way that it works is that it gives you that URL that works for one session, right? And by session, I mean that's one computer using one web browser, and like certain versions of FileMaker server will also send a cookie once you access it, so that browser can actually keep accessing that image until you clear your browser history, basically. But certain versions of FileMaker server do not give that cookie, and you get one shot and that's it. Now, if you're an API and you're trying to consume an image, you only need that one shot, right? But basically the default behavior is whoever opens the URL first is the one that gets to use it. So the best thing to do is you open up the URL and then you send off the image right away. So it's not just sitting there hanging out exposed. The URL, when you see the URLs for these things, it's something that makes sense, and then about 60 characters that are just scrambled, right? So it's not like somebody's going to find that URL in the 2 or 3 seconds in between, right?
So Sully, I want to make sure I understand something a little bit. You were talking about when you're getting a message back, and you were saying that there should be I'm not using the right terminology, but kind of a listener that's the FileMaker app that's basically saying, here comes the message, the confirmation that the message got sent. And you were saying separate that from your main app. I can kind of get that. How separate was separate there? Was that just a separate table within the main app and a layout that doesn't involve all the other stuff so that you keep it lean and mean? Or are you talking about a completely separate FileMaker database?
I'm talking about an entirely separate file. That's a good question. So like when I open my FileMaker, my text messaging in FileMaker, it is its own file. Like it's a file that all it does is send and receive text messages. And if I need visibility into those messages, I build that file into my main solution as an external data source.
Okay.
Right. So I don't want Twilio or my webhook or Claire's Connect to have any overhead whatsoever in delivering a message. So I won't put anything on the relationship graph in that file. I won't I avoid that as much as I can. Now, that is a rule that I have broken in the past. Like certain times customers will say it has to run a script in FileMaker after, immediately as soon as a text message comes in, I need it to run this scripted transaction in another file. Like, okay, you have to be aware Twilio has a time limit on the amount of time. So it's got to be under believe it's 3 seconds. You have 3 seconds to do your business for that script. If it takes longer than that, then you got to do something else, right?
And so the something else would be what? Having a flag set in the listener app that then the main app periodically says, hey, anything new I need to take care of? Or how do you do that?
So the the way to do that is by decoupling the two processes
Yeah.
with something like SQS, right? So instead of just having it do one transaction, I wonder if I might have one of these in here. Hold on. Is it this one? This is for another solution, but is this the one? Maybe it is. Right. So this chart is going to be too hard to understand. Never mind. So SQS, basically what we're talking about. Actually, no, I'm going to show it anyway. So,
It's always fun to see the dirty laundry.
Yeah. So ignore the title of this chart here for a second. This is my workaround, right? So this is a different app that had that same kind of a problem where the processing of the incoming message was a problem, right? So the script that needed to run, in other words, was taking 15 or 20 seconds, but the API wasn't allowing it to finish that. So what I would do, this is the API that was hitting the webhook, right? And it's hitting a Lambda function that says, okay, enqueue the data from that. And then as soon as that's done, then we can move on, right? As soon as that's enqueued, then that webhook or the web service that's sending me that information, it's getting back in all clear that says, we got it.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, we got it. Thank you. So it's getting under that threshold of 3 seconds, right? So, but that message is still stored in this queue. So then what happens, I wonder if it's right, retry fails. So then what happens is when I want to actually do this script, right, it's plucking something out of that queue, and then it's actually going through the process of opening up the FileMaker database, running through all this logic, and then sending back a result to the queue, right? So we've taken the queue and the web service and separated them so that one of them can run independently of the other. And this is very similar, like what I was saying when I said, there's a guy that's got, sometimes he'll get 10,000 messages in a minute, and then he's got to go and put those all in FileMaker, right? Well, you can stack up as many incoming messages as you want
In the queue.
Exactly in the queue, and have them run. And yeah, maybe it takes 10 or 15 or 20 seconds to run those, but having that queue ahead of your solution, it can make a big difference in making sure you don't lose messages. That is something that I don't believe Claris Connect has either. That's custom webhook territory, and it's something that I've provided to a few clients. It's not that difficult after you've set it up once or twice. It's the first time you set it up that's the hardest. But
gotcha. Okay,
actually,
thanks. That's helpful.
Yeah, no problem. So if you guys don't use this type of charting, it's Lucid Chart. It's one of the most useful things you can do is to actually put together flow charts of your workflows and the way that things are supposed to work, right? Like I love putting these things together because it keeps me from losing my place in what I'm doing, right? So I can put down one project and then start up a different project. Somebody can have a problem that I can fix in the middle of doing something else, and I don't lose my place in what I'm doing.
That's nice.
So, okay. Other questions? I wonder if Ron is still there. Oh yeah, you're still there.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I had to go chase the dogs and get them to stop barking.
Yep.
Well, I guess if there are no other questions, we have reached that time, so we can probably wrap it up. So last chance if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, Sully, appreciate it so much. Thank you for joining us and doing the presentation, and definitely looking forward to seeing you at Pause on Air. And I really appreciate you coming by.
Yep, I always appreciate the chance to show off some of the stuff I can do, and happy to support the community and your group. And I also look forward to seeing it pause on air. It'll be fun.
Yeah.
Thanks,
All right.
Sully.
All right, that's gonna do it. We'll wrap it
Thanks,
up,
Sully.
folks.
Yep, as always, Sully's got it, the information.
Thanks, Bev.
All right, y'all have a wonderful day. and
Yep,
We'll
take
see
care.
you next time.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks.